Well, here it is. It's the second season of Food Bites, and we've got lots of things to discuss this year. So many things that are going on around homelessness, about food insecurity, about all sorts of new initiatives that are happening, real challenges that are also taking place. There's just a lot going on. So as you're putting together these shows, I had to figure out who'd be the best one to start with, and guess who I came up with? It's Jane. That's right. I mean, we've got a lot to discuss, Jane, because a lot is happening, and a lot is happening in your field as well. So just to be clear with folks as to what happened at the beginning of COVID, you and I were often out there in the community together or separately, but we were dealing with different community groups. And then when COVID came, we had to kind of split up the work, right? And so I kept on the community piece, and you had to go down and basically spend all your time at the food bank. And then as COVID ended, we thought we might return something to what it was before, and it's not that way. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but our clientele has really gone up. We'll discuss those stats in a minute. But also, I think, as far as the challenges within the community itself, some real new things have emerged, and it's really difficult. So for you, you've been down at the food bank now since the beginning of COVID, and I know it's not been easy for you. There's going to be all sorts of changes, but do you have the main thing that you think that COVID has changed, not so much just in the area of the food bank, but also about food insecurity itself? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, let's start with the food bank perspective and then kind of work out. I think from a food bank perspective, we actually didn't just grow in terms of the people we were serving. And so you tend to think of the people, they're food insecure, and they're coming. And we grew in terms of just the numbers of people we're helping. But with it, we actually grew with how we were serving people. And that meant getting food out closer to them in their neighborhoods. I think that was huge because that was kind of a big step for us. And I think the other really big step for us was really about kind of some of the focus on the growing. And we had so many volunteers wanting to do more. We'd always grown at the back of the food bank, but all of a sudden, we had a greenhouse, we had greenhouse programs, we had green walls, all of those things. And that's all in the midst when things were really difficult. So I think that growth became incredibly important because at the beginning of COVID, it was about COVID. But then once we get to the tail end of COVID in the past year, it's actually been about inflation and just how difficult in terms of supply, some of the food supply chains, some of those kind of things, and people, the housing crisis, all of those things. So we started to see our numbers increase, and people just in the community started talking more about more local food or growing more of their own food or some of those kind of things. And we'd already kind of started that process a little bit. And I think that was really great in the context of the fact that we were there. I think in terms of the community, it's been so difficult for the past number of years. I think food has become a much bigger priority for all of us. And it doesn't matter whether you're food insecure or whether you're a community member or somebody who has not. The cost of food has been huge. The health in terms of the food that we have and the food that we eat and the abundance, the availability, the sustainability, all of those things have become top of mind for so many people. So I think when I look at the community as a whole, I think that's probably one of the biggest changes that has happened is that food has become one of the number one issues for everybody.
Yeah. Now, you and I are part of food networking across the country, Feed Ontario, which is the food banks across Ontario, and then also Food Banks Canada. We're charter members of that as well. We've been at that for over 3 decades with those two groups. But what's valuable for us, I think, is that we learn from across the country what is happening and across the province. You and I have been up to Queen's Park along with Feed Ontario, trying to help the provincial politicians see what is going on. But it is my sense that food banks across the country they're not in a time of crisis, but they're really in a time of realizing that they're going to have to change, that they many of them don't have the sustainability. And a big part of that, I think, is because people can't give as much because it's hard for the giver too. The price of food, rent, so on and so forth. But it is my sense that we're pretty lucky in London that we have not reached that kind of seriousness yet. It is serious for us, but Londoners have been so generous. We're not looking to rationing or cutting back. At the same time, we know we have to develop a new model for the future.
Yeah, I think when you talk about it not being a crisis for food banks, I think overall, in many ways, it is. We've talked. We went to some of those meetings, and it was actually kind of emotional.
Yeah.
Hearing folks who have been around for 30 years and talk about how some of them are actually having to potentially close. Now, some of these are smaller food banks, some of these are whatever, but it's just been so difficult. And I think it's not just because of, let's say, a lack of support per se in terms of some of the givers. I think it's a lot of, they're getting older. Most food banks work on volunteer models, and then the population that it helps weren't able to actually come. They were seniors. It's difficult. It's a lot more physical. So I think it overall became more and more difficult. And I think what we're facing now is this sustainable? It's, yes, of course, Londoners have been amazing and it's been wonderful and we've been so well supported and it's been great. And we don't have some of those kind of issues, but we are seeing a 43% increase over last year. Like over 1 year, we're now close to 6,000 families a month. Like, how can we be sustainable doing that? Do we spend a lot more money on staff? The community it's just really difficult to continue to assist in the way that we've been assisting and keep it going at this level. I don't really know how some of the larger food banks do it. So a place like Toronto obviously has got when you talk about a housing crisis and how difficult it is, I mean, we help once a month with, let's say, a week's worth of food. They're helping once a week. How, like that must just be so difficult to sustain. But obviously people are in real need, and that's the thing that's really tough for me. We're in the end a community response to need, and the need is just, it's outstripping our ability to help overall, I think.
Yeah. It seems to me that when COVID came along, governments were pretty generous towards food banks. They were towards other groups as well. So they came forward with a lot of cash and resources to be able, even food, to be able to help food banks get through the crisis. To step up to the challenges that they were facing. A lot of food banks spent that money, right? And sometimes it was for more staff, sometimes it was for more food or whatever. But I think for most of them that we have talked to, they just thought, like, this is a crisis right now, and but once COVID is gone, we'll get back to normal. And what they suddenly realized was there is no normal anymore. That is good. Their numbers have gone up huge. The amount of agencies that they're helping is increasing, and also those agencies are in crisis. The problem is they had spent their reserve money during COVID. So they're really facing a challenge there. And that's really true a lot, too, for smaller food banks, right? Rural food banks and others, they're the ones that are really under threat at the moment. But we made a conscious decision. Do you remember that at the board meeting? We made a conscious decision that we were not going to do that. We weren't going to try to get a bigger building or hire more staff or do those kind of things. We were going to hold in reserve that money because it was now clear that new developments were taking place that we were going to have to address. So one of them would be homelessness. Right. We took on the homeless lunch program at the beginning of COVID, and it was awesome. I mean, it was just awesome. RBC Place came along and said that they would make the meals for us. Groups like 519 Pursuit, YOU, Youth Opportunities Unlimited, and others, they were taking that food and delivering it to where the homeless were. I mean, that was really an awesome thing. But the public and the business community, groups like developers and others, were giving lots of money towards that program because they didn't want to see homeless people being vulnerable. But even there, I remember I was almost there almost every day in that first year at RBC Place. I remember talking it over with the chefs, and we just thought, yeah, this will die down when COVID ends. And and it didn't work out that way. That's still going on now, and groups are trying to get us to expand even farther with it. So I think that was a real thing that we weren't expecting. And it drove me back to kind of the original days of food banking when people thought, yeah, when the recession is over, people won't need food banks anymore. And it never happened. The numbers went up and they stayed high. I do think, though, the difference with this one is that for the givers, for the donors, it's way harder to give right now.
Yeah, I think it's true in part because the cost of everything has gone up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, over in previous times of recession, other things, I mean, inflation wasn't the same way that, or maybe it was, I don't know enough in terms of that context, but I do definitely know this time, I mean, you're talking the housing prices, the rent prices are huge. The food prices, they're not necessarily increasing at the same rate as they were a year ago, but they're still increasing. And there's a side to which that hits all of us, and it's really, really difficult. Yeah. So I think it's right. I think I do remember going to the the provincial meetings a few years ago, still in COVID, and they said, look, our numbers are going up, but they did, a couple of the folks were saying, look, they're going to stay up, they're not going to go down, but you don't really feel that until you start to feel it, and we're really feeling it now, definitely. And of course, they were banging the drums back then, but now we're seeing it. We're seeing the impact, and it's been difficult for sure.
So let's go back historically a bit. If you remember, at the beginning, we were there when food banks were all starting up and things were happening, and it was awesome. But there were criticisms of food banks at that time by some traditional groups who felt that you're getting government off the hook or whatever it was. And our attitude as the London Food Bank was, look, up until now, governments have been involved in doing these things, but citizens have always wanted in. They've always wanted to be a part of taking care of their own in the community. And this was providing that opportunity. And I think that really played itself out well across the country, not just in London. Citizens, businesses, associations, even legacy gifts, those kind of things, like people really got involved with that. But now, as you move forward almost 40 years later, you're beginning to see the limitations of that. The citizens want in, but if they are the sole suppliers of food banks, and citizens are now really feeling the effect of inflation, of COVID, of all the other things we're talking about, there's a limiting factor in there in which food banks cannot expand beyond a certain point. And I remember the leaders of the provincial organization telling us that at one of the meetings.
Yeah, and should food banks expand? Should food banks be the answer to food insecurity, to people needing help? I don't think so. I think we are a community response. I think we're one of the answers. I think we're there in an emergency to help out. But the emergencies are becoming constant crises. I think that's the difficult thing. I think we continually meet people who have had to use the service because they didn't have work and it helped them through a tough time. And I think that's great because you're seeing people go through the process. Mm-hmm. But again, the numbers of people are huge. You did mention, other food banks through COVID, tripled in size with regards to staff. Well, we kind of did too, but we did that with volunteers, and the community responded. But there's still limitations on how much volunteers can do, and you still have to organize them. And also, we are a food bank, and we will assist with the homeless crisis and the homeless situation, but if the volunteers were actually dealing directly with the homeless, it would be very, very difficult. There would be a whole level of training and a whole level of difficulty associated with that. Right now, we collect food, we sort it, we make sure it's safe, and we hand it out. I think as long as we're working with volunteers and we continue that, I actually think there's always a place. But I don't know, 6,000 families, how many more families can we assist? 10,000? It gets really, really tough.
So it'll be within the next month, it will be 6,000. We had a board meeting last night, for instance, and we just heard that it was up to 5,900, something like that. Yeah. Yeah,
5860 or something. Yeah. Over 15,000 individuals.
That's right. So that will be 6,000 within a month. And then that also does represent the 16,000 individuals that we're trying to feed every month. And of that, Jane, what are the percentages? I know them, but you were the one that reported them. You'll know them better. How much of that has helped at the food bank, and how much of that has helped in the community neighborhood depots that we cooperate with?
So I think there's a few components of the food bank, the London Food Bank, in terms of what we do. So we people come directly to us. So 80% of that is people coming directly to us, and that's done through people coming through the front door. It's also done through workers that call us, and we get the packages ready. And then we have satellite locations where the information is centralized, but the distribution is decentralized. And that's the mobile food bank. That's the truck that goes out. And then that's these resource centers where we send food to the resource centers, and they serve people. But if you go to the resource center, it's like coming to us. So we, as a result, keep all of that as one statistic. And 20% right now are being served in their neighborhoods. 80% are being served at the central location here. That doesn't even include the 25 agencies plus the programs that we assist on top of that. So, add another 50%, and that's how many Londoners are getting helped through, again, Londoners' generosity.
Yeah. But it is true, right? Like when we look at the givings have helped us to keep level, not to shrink down. But when your numbers go up, or the demand on us goes up 42% in a year, that's a lot, we've never begged Londoners for anything or whatever it is like that, but we have to let them know that is the difficulty that we are going to be facing. And I think one of the things we've really realized, even at the board meeting last night, is we're no longer just there ourselves trying to help those 6,000 families or 16,000 individuals. The agencies that are out there are looking increasingly to the food bank to help them, because they might have more trouble raising funds or food or whatever, and we really have to be there for them. So it's like you're a family, you're a husband and a wife, and then all of a sudden a couple of kids come along and you look at your budget and it spreads out as you look at those things. That's happening to us on an ongoing basis. We're taking on more responsibilities around homelessness, maybe helping another agency that's asking us for assistance. It's like this movable thing, and we can't just kind of sit down and really make a solid concrete plan, because the community itself is changing and morphing even as we're talking.
Yeah, it is. It's changing and morphing, and people are going through different kinds of difficulties, right? In terms of, we are getting more people who are working. I mean, I know there's a lot of positions out there, particularly in the service sector, et cetera, but there's still a lot of people working that are having to come to us for help as well. So I for sure, it's true. In terms of what are we going to be and how are we going to kind of reimagine the future, I think that's it's still to be determined. I do think there's some things that have changed a little bit operationally, and so again, we really believe in those programs, and some of those programs started due to COVID, but we actually view them as core. So how are we going to help with the homeless situation? Are people without shelter, and to be able to do that in a different way that's not here, but still assist. I think those things are all great. Vision Soho is another one. I know that's a little bit on hold, but we're about the community, and we're about food, and we're not just about the food bank. We're about people who need help. But our way to help that is obviously with food.
Yeah. Can we talk just a little bit about the difference between food insecurity and food security? So, food insecurity has been what food banks have been all about. And, some people, they hit times of crisis or emergency, they lost their job, or they got sick, or they couldn't afford their apartment anymore, or whatever it was. And so they had to depend on food banks. That was seen as food insecurity. That's what happens when people hit a crisis time. But what we're seeing increasingly now is that is happening more and more. And it's why so many people are coming to food banks now who never would have done it before. Food security, though, and you and I have talked a lot about this in this last while. Food security is about the ability of people to be able to afford their own food, right? But it's also the ability of a community, in this case London, to be able to produce that kind of food or draw in food from the outlying regions, but also to have it so that it's affordable and accessible for everybody. So it's not just about helping people that are of low income or struggling right now. it's making it that way for everybody. And I do believe that the food bank during COVID, we took on, the greenhouse, and then we've taken on some other initiatives that deal with food security. How do you grow food internally within your community, so it's not all dependent on a grocery store system that could be expensive? And I think we've done a fairly adequate job of that. We put greenhouses out around the community in churches and houses of faith in other places. I think we've also given out green walls, and we've partnered with other groups. But it feels to me that, and this is maybe the most important thing, that we're almost reaching the max when it comes to food insecurity and how we deal with it. If you keep using the donor base to do that, at some point you're going to hit a wall. And I think all food banks are coming closer to that. That's what their worry is. The answer to that is not to try to have bigger and better food drives. The answer to that is for every community to find ways to grow within its own community so that people can do that, and that can be part of the system. I do believe that conversation is much more real now than it was a year ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think people much smarter than you and I are continually defining food security and food insecurity. I think there's a food policy council. I think there's a provincial food policy council of Food Secure Canada. I think the federal government has started a national food policy council, which actually looks at policies, and a lot of those policies deal with food distribution, or a farmer might grow food, let's say outside of London, but it goes up to the food terminal. Some of those kind of things. That food policy is kind of bigger. But I do think when you talk food security and you talk about the community's ability to feed itself, it's having a food secure city so people don't have to come to a food bank, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's and part of that is the neighborhood growing, it's people taking care of each other, it's we all grow more food, it's urban agriculture, it's a stronger links with the farmer. Like, there's so many things to it, I think, but really it's in the end about all of us. And I think there's parts to it that, of course, help folks who don't have enough. And so they do intersect food insecurity, food security. But I think the simplest way to think about that for us is people who don't have enough, we give them food. But food security is about this growing and obviously the community having enough. I think one of the programs which fits within the food security side is obviously things like food waste, right? So when you talk food security, you go farmer to fork and then to the waste side. Yeah. And that's where it intersects with food insecurity, because we do waste a lot of food, and grocery stores have been really good at getting produce to us that we support, or farmers that can't sell getting produce to us. That's actually in many ways dealing more about food waste, but we're using it in such a way to help people who need it. So that's where food security intersects with this insecurity idea. And generally when you talk to people who work on food insecurity, their answer is it's not giving people more food, it's giving people money to buy their own food.
More income.
And food security, more income. And food security is really about making sure food is accessible and affordable for all of us.
Yeah. So can we talk about something that's got nothing to do with food? We're near the end we're near the end of the program here, and I remember when COVID was going on, I was putting out these food bites as part of the Food Bank YouTube channel, and Rogers contacted us and said, "Would you be willing to do this as a show on Rogers?" And they've been awesome. I mean, they're such a good community resource. But then just a few weeks ago, we found out that there's a new person coming on to Rogers and doing a show. And who would that person be? Do you know?
Well, it's actually the episode that you and I shot about this show a little while ago is already aired. So this is so it's the paint box, and in many ways you're to blame for this, Glenn. You talked me into this as far as something that we should do. So it's in my spare time I work to paint, and the paint box is about trying to kind of showcase what's going on within the community about art, particularly about visual.
Can I give you a little surprise here? I actually have the introduction here, so are you ready? It only lasts a minute, but hang in. So you've been embarrassed by that, Jane?
A little bit, but that's okay.
I know, but I think the thing that Rogers was really interested in is that there's a lot going on around painting in London. There's so many people paint. There are galleries that a lot of people don't know much about, but also people are working through the process of their own pain, isolation, grief, maybe even joy or whatever it is. They're using paint as kind of a therapy thing. And one of the things we've learned about COVID is coming out of COVID, way more people are looking towards that kind of thing to help them cope. COVID made them feel vulnerable, maybe not understood as well, or having trouble finding the particular words to say that they were at. But one of the things I've appreciated about where you're going to be going with this, I mean, you're going to be doing it every week. It's going to be on Monday night at 5:30. Right, it's going to become much more popular than this show, right? And people are going to be interested. But you're not just trying to show the techniques of painting or whatever it is. What is it that you're truly after?
Yeah, so it's not actually just about painting, though obviously I'm a painter in that sense. It's about visual art.
Yeah.
And it's about what London is already doing. So I think there's four main pillars of it. And I use the word accessibility, but I really don't, it's not what I mean. It's about kind of exploring what's already happening and making art accessible in the sense of understandable, that it's not so distant. And so there's a number of wonderful artists, so it's kind of showcasing the artists within the city. There's a number of galleries that both public and private within the city in terms of that are trying to bring art to folks. There's a great art history here, but there's some organizations within the city that are art-based focused or visual art-based focused, like TAP, the Arts Project, even Arts for All Kids,
At the Food Bank, yeah.
At the London Food Bank, which actually tries to get people exposed to art. And then events. There's a fair number of groups that use art as a way art events. So it could be like Up With Art happened at the beginning of the summer with regard to the Unity Project, those kind of things. So again, it's mainly to showcase what's happening within the city and some of the region, some of the areas, like South Huron, St. Thomas, some of Port Stanley, those kind of places as well.
Yeah. And a lot of those artists are allowing their talents and creativity to be used to help groups that have struggled through COVID and helping, like you mentioned, the Unity Project. They have their big thing each year, Up With Art, in which they use it as a fundraiser to help them with their homeless programs and things like that. So I think you've happened on something here that's kind of it happens in London, but a lot of people don't realize it. On the other hand, there are a lot of people that are part of that community that need to be more discovered, I think, and to see the contributions that they are making.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit about discovery, and it's a little bit about being discovered, and that kind of, and not even so much about being discovered, but just showing people what's happening and what's out there. I think people are involved in art, and art is different things to different people, and even that's like a philosophical question. What's the purpose of art in the midst of COVID, right? And there are some great minds and great creative minds within the city as well, just to sit down and talk about. I mean, I think of the Arts Council, or I even think of, some of the folks who have been historically involved in the art movement and bringing art to folks. I think there's so many things to be explored. I'm kind of excited about it because I'm really curious to talk. I don't have the words yet. I think we talked in our show, I'm a visual learner and a visual communicator. So to this is going to be a bit of a verbal show. Obviously, we're going out to see people, and there's going to be a lot of great things we're going to show. But it's kind of exciting to learn, to be honest, and to explore and talk to folks. So I'm excited about it.
Well, Jane Hardy, congratulations. I think that's awesome. I mean, you've got your own TV show that's coming up. You're going to beat your husband in ratings week. Not that happens. But anyway, I think it's going to be great. But I think, obviously, the thrust of this program is that we're entering a new future around food and our relationship with food. And unless we find ways of getting more of it to be more affordable for people, then we're all got really dark days ahead. And I think we as a food bank want to take part in leading that.